So here in chapter three, what we've done so far is we kind of just set the stage for why settlements occurred the way that they did in the New World. But just like anything, the New World, the United States in this case, wouldn't have survived unless there was some economic interest for the Old World to support it, especially in the beginning. And so, what we want to understand in this chapter is basically what did the economic framework look like for the colonies? What were the products being produced? And what the labor conditions were, and how did that influence and impact the relationships between the various colonies and the old world. And what we're going to see as well is that the relationship that basically seeing the colonies collectively isn't appropriate to do. Rather, what you want to do is you want to keep to that structure of the southern colonies, the middle colonies, and the northern colonies. Because they had different economic activities, they in turn had different labor relations, and they also in turn had different relationships with the old world. Okay, so again, AI slides, there will be errors, I am certain. Okay. So again, as I just said here, we're going to look at the agricultural crops, and agriculture is going to be quite key in understanding the economic activities of each of the individual colonies, and as well that um, again, as I said, that the relationship between the colonies and the old world, that's going to be impacted by the crops that are being grown, and that's going to in turn impact what the trade networks look like. And we wouldn't expect that the trade networks would be the same. In terms of craftsmanship and industry, I'm not entirely too sure why AI put this in the slide, because to be honest, there's not a lot. That was the point of the New World. The New World, I mean, if local craftsmen were producing essential goods, it was only for home production. They would not have been exporting finished goods back to the old world. Maybe that's what AI tried to think of. They wouldn't have gotten that from the textbook. And so I guess we will disprove that the last point, um, local craftsmanship, building of essential goods, does not, does not contribute to colonial economic diversity, despite what this slide says. But I guess that's why you paid the big money for an economic historian to be teaching this class, rather than a quote unquote faculty member who just reads a slide. Yeah, that was a slight dig to those faculty members that just read slides, but I think it's a pretty annoying feature of teaching an online class and saying you're delivering a lecture is that you just read a slide. Um, yeah, this slide's actually okay. Because it does actually do a pretty good summary of, again, what I like about this textbook is it draws out that distinction between the southern, middle, and northern colonies. And what you see here is that difference between the southern colonies that are relying primarily on tobacco and rice, that the middle colonies are relying on grain production, and that New England is either doing fishing, some agriculture, although again, as it says here, is not large scale. The small scale manufacturing that's being done is largely done within the colonies itself, as would the shipbuilding as well. They are not building ships of the size needed um, for the old world. The old world would have been producing their own ocean faring ships. Um, these ships would not have been large. And so I don't think that it qualifies as um, really the primary activity of New England. New England would be, I would say we should focus on here fishing, small scale manufacturing, and small scale agriculture. One of the things, though, that we see, which are incredibly important in the colonies, is that, yes, I mean, we can get a sense that, like, geography and climate had a big deal to do with why these different colonies focused on what they did. That in the southern colonies, where the land was quite ample and where you had enough humidity slash water, then tobacco and rice could be grown in that kind of environment. In the middle colonies, where you can still have a bit of a harsh winter and where you could still have um, and where you could still have some you know transportation, I guess, to the frontier, quote unquote, the frontier, then that does work well for grain production, primarily corn, soybean. Well, they wouldn't have been really growing soybeans, but certainly wheat and corn. And then again, for the northern colonies, because the winters are so harsh, you don't have a very long of a growing season to be doing things. But we're getting that specialization within these colonies. And so then it helps as well that when the colonies are trading with each other, right, we're getting that kind of specialization that Adam Smith, right at around the time of the colony's formation, right, 1776, that's exactly the kind of specialization that Adam Smith deemed critical to an economy being able to develop and to be able to thrive. And so you get these trade networks building not only between and amongst the colonies, but then the colonies are creating their own special trade networks with specific countries and specific regions of countries based on the goods that they're producing. So you really do get, rather than seeing the United States as a whole and just having a single specialization, you really almost, in some sense, have, well, not necessarily 13 individual countries, but you probably have 4 to 5. Certainly, you've got kind of one country being the middle colonies, southern, and then New England. And then I would even argue a fourth and a fifth, the fourth being the what we would consider the Northwest Territories, which would be present day Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, which would have been supplying more of the furs. And then the fifth quote unquote country being present day St. Louis and all along the Mississippi River Basin, where you would imagine that that industry is largely linked to transportation um, using the waterways and obviously furs and other kind of frontier activities. The the biggest trade network here, the biggest trade network would have been with England. And I mean, these were British colonies, so that in some sense makes sense. And England provided the protection and kind of administration of the colonies from a distance because they benefited financially from this economic arrangement. The problems obviously emerge when, in some sense, you could say when the British get a little cheap and they start asking for reimbursement through taxation for all these expenses of what they're paying for. Maybe if they hadn't done that, we wouldn't have gotten the Revolutionary War. But considering the 13 colonies as a whole, again, what you have is an abundance of land and natural resource abundance that the old world didn't have. And the mercantilist relationships that we had at that point meant that the old world was going to, quote unquote, use the new world to supply it with the raw resources and then sell back to the New World the finished products. People during the colonial period absolutely depended on the land, not only for agriculture and your general natural resource extraction, such as fishing and animal furs, but the land shaped the early development of the country. I mean, the land, I mean, for as few people as lived in the New World, there weren't enough people to kind of appreciate the vastness of the land. Every colonist wanted to own land, and the land did seem limitless. And again, when you draw that comparison, in the New World, since the labor was always scarce, and every immigrant had, in large part, come to the New World because they wanted to have the land. It would give them that kind of wealth and position that they couldn't have in the Old World. Then, that shapes the development. The other thing that really shapes the development of the New World, besides the abundance of land, is the abundance of wood. Wood shaped everything, and there was so much of it that they basically, if it could be built in some sense with wood, they did it. Not only are they building their homes with wood, but even the early roads are being built with wood. You've got the wagons and carriages built with wood. You've got the farming done with woods, and as we'll see later when we start to talk about New England, the building at least of small to even as large as medium-sized ships are all being done with wood. Okay, so for as I said, the scarcity of labor is defining a great deal of the economic development in the colonies. The abundance of land and certainly the abundance of wood is defining the economic profile of the New World. But then also the capital scarcity is defining it. In deep contrast to what we know today, what economists know today about how economies develop, is that economic development, well, it depends. I mean, in some sense, the colonies had something going for them and didn't have something going for them in terms of one day perhaps becoming a developed and independent country. The thing that the colonies had going for them is that they had stable laws, right? They got it from being colonies of England, a well-established monarchy, right? And yes, it was a monarchy in the sense that, you know, King George ran the show. At the same time, because of things like the Magna Carta, um, individuals still had certain rights. Yeah, again, not as many as in other countries, but remember at the time, you really didn't have democracies. You had monarchies. And, without, at least up until 1776, you had a pretty stable set of laws and administration. So that made for having strong economic development in the colonies. On the other hand, anyone who knows anything about development economics would know that you also want a lot of capital investment, right? This would be, for instance, why China imposes the one child rule in 1979 is because, right, development economists would have said to them, if people keep replicating as quick as they are, you don't have enough investments in capital to spread across all the people that are being created. in terms of the colonies, you know, there isn't a great deal of capital investment in the colonies. And that's because you're not you're not creating an economy that's delivering finished goods that would require great skill levels or machinery or extensive buildings or whatnot. Additionally, the colonies weren't going to get the significant investments that were needed. The you know the in terms of loans, you know, yeah, the rate of return might be pretty high, but you have to remember these joint stock companies are really kind of running things individually and are ones that are profiting the most. And Britain's not going to be making a lot of independent loans to the colonies. They want to keep this dependency going. And that's what we get here with number 4. The colonies did rely heavily on external sources for capital, and England just wasn't going to be providing it. I love these pictures. I don't think that that's a picture from Georgia. That looks pretty AI generated to me. Um, the textbook does provide sort of a case study on Georgia, obviously a southern colony. It was the last colony to be established, and originally was designed to, in some sense, it ultimately became one where uh, prisoners and whatnot were sent to, because at the time we still had debtors' prisons. And kind of like Australia was for Britain, Britain didn't want to keep their prisoners at the country if they didn't have to. So they would send them to Australia, or in this case, send them to Georgia. This was the idea of um, General James Edward Oglethorpe. Um, you know, the, at the time, debt was seen as a kind of a mortal sin, I guess, to some extent. And so the idea, but like in religion, with the idea of sin, is that there's always hope that you'll repent and reform yourself. And the idea was, well, let them come to Australia or to Georgia in this case, and let them uh, reform themselves and be better citizens in the end. In the end, it didn't really work. Uh, yeah, there were, prisoners did come, but the problem is that they didn't get enough of them. And additionally, England wasn't willing to provide the kind of subsidy that you need to provide when you've got prisoners. They weren't providing enough of a subsidy. And so the only thing that really made sense for the growing of these crops was turning back to having slaves like the other southern colonies had. And so the reason why this is called Georgia social engineering and economic constraints is that, again, on the one hand, in the social engineering, it's the Anglicans and Church of England people that are calling for Georgia as a way to kind of live out the ideals of the Anglican Church, which would be discouraging people from going too far into debt and committing that sin, but if they do commit that sin, giving them a path to redemption. And despite what those social engineering goals were, the economic constraints didn't make it work. Right. And eventually, again, you have to just go to slavery and just focusing on the crops that the other southern colonies are using. So then when we look at what defines not even just in general, but all of the colonies. The biggest limits are generally going to be labor and going to be capital. And it's how the individual colonies respond to those labor and capital constraints that shapes how they are structuring their economies. On top of that, at this stage, right? So here we're talking late 1600s through pretty much, let's say up to 1760s, early 1770s. You don't have any banks, at least New World independent banks in in the New World, right? Why would the British give that up? So all the banking relationships are going to be occurring through England, which means that any money that people in the New World have goes back to England, right? If it's going to be saved or it's going to be invested. And if you're starting a business or you're starting an endeavor in the New World that needs money, you're going to have to do it via England and those banks. So there you go, right? Everything is constrained and dictated by England, mediated by England, because it controls the money. That's the big thing. In terms of labor scarcity, well, you can't do a great deal about that. I mean, it is growing pretty quick, but you also have a great deal of land. And you know, people are just replicating as fast as they can, but they're also still dying pretty quickly too. What we see pretty early on when we look at these development patterns, again, is this idea that the southern colonies are structured differently than the middle and the northern colonies. And the reason why is that the southern colonies, more so than the other colonies, relies heavily on agricultural goods. Again, with those staple crops being cotton, tobacco, and rice. And that pretty much defines um, how those colonies are structured. They are relying on slaves to manage large plantations. They don't really have to worry a lot about transportation infrastructure outside of having really good ports. So, you don't, there's really only, well, to be honest, there's only two things that are really important in the southern colonies. One, having the enslaved labor, because you need that large labor source to manage the size of these plantations. And then the second thing that would be quite important would be having the ship transportation from the ports, namely ports such as Charlotte, Savannah, um, uh, what else would it be? Savannah would have been quite big at this point. Charlotte would have been quite big at this point. Um, Maybe even as far north as like Baltimore, if you can get it up that far, because now we're starting to reach into the middle colonies. Um, yeah, Norfolk, I guess. Norfolk would also be a pretty important port at this point. And the destination would all be, for the most part, England. And so that's why especially when we get into uh, uh, the next chapter and even the chapter after that, chapter 7, that their journey to the new world and their journey to the point where they are going to no longer be with England is very different. The southern colonies aren't going to have an incredibly strong interest in um, being independent from England because that is their biggest market. So why would you want to cut that off unnecessarily? You wouldn't. For the most part, the let me make sure here. Yeah, we're about right here, more or less. Most everybody in the colonies is engaged in farming. The textbook, and as we have here in the slides, about 90%. Yes, absolutely very important. Uh, you know, you're going to structure the economy's infrastructure around the growing of things, the growing of an excess of things that can then be exported to the old world. What that means is that you've got some fair amount of local economic development because, you know, in the beginning at least, you're just going to grow enough food to feed your family and the local community. But then again, over time, what you're going to do is you're going to focus on the export of goods. And it's that, especially in the southern colonies, where they're growing enough of an excess quickly enough that they very early on, probably to some extent, faster than any of the other colonies, are exporting their goods, their agricultural goods to England. Middle colonies, again, grain production, again, talking about corn, wheat, they're not producing sufficiently large amounts that they can export any great deal. And again, New England, nah. I mean, all that agriculture is subsistence, enough for the communities themselves, such that they don't have to import anything. And I mean, if we wanted to, again, think of these three regions, the southern, the middle, and the northern colonies, it really was the southern colonies that, if you were to kind of be an outside observer, it was the southern colonies that were the strongest economically. They had large plantations where the enslaved labor was able to specialize sufficiently, where you had certain economies of scale, and where you had an infrastructure that permitted quick export, cheap export of those agricultural goods back to England. Yes, it helped that you didn't have to pay the laborers much, right? So it helped that there was slave labor, but it wasn't just that. Um, it was important, and I'm not trying to diminish its importance, but I also just want to say it's not exclusively the reliance on enslaved labor that made the South, in my view, and the view of a number of economic historians, that it made the southern colonies the strongest economically. The middle colonies in New England, just too small scale, right? They're just surviving. And the southern colonies really are thriving here throughout the 18th century. I guess the first question I always think for myself here when I look at the slides is this accurate? Um, it is accurate, but it is deceiving, this graph. Why is it deceiving, you may ask? Oh, I think this is really good. Maybe, I was thinking last night, I was like, you know, I did make lectures last night, and I was thinking, gosh, everyone in class must think I'm like really lazy for having made using these AI generated graphs. But I think it's kind of fun finding the errors. So the error here would be, why would you show two graphs side by side where the southern colony is showing production? And the key says even production in the terms, but the European graph on the right is actually consumption, not production. So what is it telling us? It's largely telling us that the southern colonies were generating enough of the agricultural goods to do that large scale export to England, and England wanted all that the southern colonies could produce and then some: tobacco, rice, and indigo used for clothing and whatnot. So there you go, right? I mean, in some sense, southern colonies would have been better off just breaking off from the middle and northern colonies and forming, and just keeping their reliance to England. Um, and England might not have cared that much to give up the northern and the middle colonies if they could have just kept the south. It provides for us kind of an alternative view of history that I'm sure I'm not the first person to say that or think of that, but I'd encourage you to kind of think of it as well, as we're trying to rethink kind of our notions, our historical notions here, is that the southern colonies were the strongest and they could have been, that things could have looked different had they not joined the northern and middle colonies in the Revolutionary War. The southern colonies, when they're growing the tobacco, what they needed was a really long season and they needed really good soil. They had that, right? And that's kind of like number one and number two. So to grow tobacco, the way that you grow it, you need a rather long season and rich soil. And what you're having to do is that as you use up, right? And because at the time they don't know a lot about, good growing patterns and whatnot. And so what they end up having to do is they have to keep expanding west to get more and more fertile land. That's kind of like number three. And what's helping the South as well is that you're getting the river access internally so that you can ship things to, again, um, Durham, to Savannah, um, you know, not really New Orleans, but you've got enough transportation to get things even to Baltimore that's going to allow you to do the exporting to Europe. Those plantations that were the largest were the ones that are winning this battle, and you're not going to really get the small, as Jefferson would call it, Thomas Jefferson would call it, the yeoman farmer, the small subsistence related farmer. You're not going to see that in the South. Bigger is better. Um, Bigger is cheaper. And not only is that true in the southern colonies, but also to a bit more of a limited extent in the middle colonies, such as Maryland, where you've got, again, the growing of wheat, and to a more limited extent, corn. Bigger is better. I think Jefferson's being a little bit too romantic in his thinking of it. The other thing that we get, I just want to make sure I'm not going too far here. Well, okay, so I've said this, and I've already kind of said this as well. I guess the last thing I could say here about point number 3 here again is to go back to this idea that capital and the banking system was always a limit in the colonies. And so the bigger the plantation, the greater their ability to establish those working relationships with the English banks to be able to do what they're to get the equipment, but then also to kind of sustain the plantation over time until the harvesting season. That's for tobacco. Then when we look at rice, which sometimes we don't really think about it that much, and to some extent with indigo as well. Usually when we think of the southern colonies, we focus much more so on just tobacco or even cotton. But rice and indigo is also quite important. Um, the rice, you're able to grow those in just kind of the swampy areas. And then what you're doing is you're growing it still with the plantation style. But what you're doing is you're then building dikes and you're basically controlling the flooding, controlling the tidal flow, right, which you can do. And you're doing that so that you can control and manage uh, that growing process for the rice. And again, then you've got uh, the slaves working that land, and again, those large plantations. What you're seeing um, as a difference, though, when you go to indigo, is indigo's requiring a bit more specialized labor to grow it. So indigo would be a blue dye, and you're using this blue dye, especially in clothing. The British really wanted indigo, and they couldn't get it reliably from really anywhere else. I mean, yes, they could get it from the Caribbean colonies, um, right? Your Bermudas or your Hades or whatnot. But what you really want are, what we collectively would call the West Indies. But what you really needed, to grow it in the southern colonies is you needed to bring that specialized labor and that specialized skill set to the colonies to help grow it. So even if you're using slaves, those slaves, the slave owner is incredibly dependent upon them. And so these 3 things, tobacco, rice, and indigo, those are the things that are being grown in large scale, efficient structures and exported to England. These are rather minor. I don't want you to think that it's only those 3 things. You've got deerskin. You've got the things that are used in the production of ships, such as tar, pitch, and turpentine. You've got some iron production, but not very much. Subsistence farming and livestock raising, I'm not even sure why AI lists those things. Those aren't of any sufficient quantity to even be mentioned. Yeah, I know it's mentioned in the book as well, but in terms of this whole slide, just think unimportant. It really is all coming down to tobacco, rice, and indigo. To define the southern colonies with any other goods, these are minor things, and they're certainly not shaping the economic or organizational infrastructure of the southern colonies. That gets us to the middle colonies, which with another AI-generated graph. That even in AI, they covered the words, so let's change it. So what are the middle colonies? This would be from north of Virginia all the way. So this would be largely like Maryland, Pennsylvania. Um, no, that I mean Pennsylvania and Maryland. That would be so we're basically going from the Potomac to the Hudson rivers. And what you're seeing there is like the South, you've got quite fertile land. You've got a slightly shorter growing season. So that works well for, again, corn and wheat, where the growing season's a bit shorter. And yes, the land does get a little bit tired, but as it does get a bit tired, you just go a little bit further west. What distinguishes the middle colonies from the southern colonies is that you're not going to be that these farms are not plantation style and that these farms are not you're not using uh, enslaved labor to produce them. You've got some, I mean, it's not that it's illegal, but you just don't have very many. But the farms are much smaller. And so, again, not a lot of export. The relationships to England, the economic relationship to England, are not as strong as they are for the southern colonies. And that's what we have right here. Right, you've got some navigable rivers, I guess is what they're calling it here. And so you've got some internal trade, but it's largely subsistence and community based trade rather than um, creating things for export. But Philadelphia at this point would be um, what at least the second largest city, um, and probably at one time was the largest city in the New World. Obviously, quickly taken over by it'd be New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Those would be the three big cities, towns, I guess, um, in the New World. But again, even as big as they are, if anything, all that's happening in these cities is that's really just kind of operating as our points of trade, with the ports being quite important for some of those export of goods. When it comes to New England, kind of let's say in my kind of structure to you, saying like, let's think of these as three independent countries. Southern colonies, again, largely an export country. The middle colonies, subsistence and agriculturally related. And then New England, also largely subsistence, but not as much agriculture. So there is a greater reliance on, just because of the shorter growing season, there's a little bit more of small scale manufacturing and shipbuilding than the other colonies. And that's what we kind of see here, right? That there are some ships being built, but the ships are not that big. And certainly not the prime ships are not being built. The other thing would be is that again, you've got a great deal of wood and whatnot, and that's helping New England, as well as the better developed ports, especially within New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Uh, Boston, especially because it's faster to get there from England, and you've got the strong shipping area, which again explains why that's where them getting pissed off at England for the taxation without representation, which all came down to trade, it affected Bostonians much more so in a negative way. Fishing, not enough cod or other fish being caught to have any meaningfully large export to Europe. There's some, but I think this AI slide's overstating it a bit. But what is important again is when we think of the northern colonies, the specialty there is going to be on the shipping, the ports, and the closest connection to the financial markets that you're going to get in the New World to the Old World. When we look at how the wealth is distributed, it's when we think of the northern colonies, it's just, I don't know what to say here. I mean, it's just it's not that rich of colonies. As I said, the southern colonies are where the economic growth is at the time. New England's just trying to survive. Middle colonies, even themselves, are just trying to survive. The richness, the wealth, is all in the South. And so if we compare, in terms of wealth equality, there isn't. At least across all 13 colonies. It's just, you can tell that the southern colonies are rich and the northern colonies are poor. But then within the colonies themselves, you do have a bit more of equal distribution. They're all either equally rich or all equally poor within a single colony. Again, with the exception of the enslaved. And then when we turn to, let me pause here for a second just so I can have a sip of water here. So when we think of the manufacturing that's occurring, it's all largely related to extraction. You're not seeing any large-scale industrial production as we see here in number one. But in number two, really you're going to organize your infrastructure around extracting the natural resources and exporting those back to the old world. What would that be? Well, the big ones would be, again, wood, the forest, the furs, although the French focused a bit more on the furs, and most of the fur trade's being done in the Northwest Territory, again, current day Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois. The wood is being used for fuel, it's being used for construction. You'd be exporting it to England, but for the most part, you're going to probably use a great deal of the wood internally. And then the only other thing that's, I guess, somewhat interesting to talk about would be ores. So you've got especially for wrought and cast iron, now you've got incredibly established iron industries in England, but pretty quickly the forges and furnaces that you need to produce wrought and cast iron, they were, because of this abundance of the ore itself in the New World, they had enough of it that it was cheaper just to make the iron in the New World and then ship it to the Old World. The estimate that the textbook gives us is that at some point we're getting almost 30,000 tons of wrought and cast iron being produced in the New World, which would be about, as the textbook gives us, about a seventh of the world's total output. That's pretty big, and most of that's being done in the northern colonies. And then again, what you're doing is you're just shipping that back to England. But again, England, they don't want the colonies to have that much manufacturing because that would in turn make them less dependent on the old world. And that's what we see right here, right? That they want to stop the manufacturing industries in England. Sorry, in the New World. And so England is going to do things like pass the Navigation Acts. And again, they're going to do what they can to restrict finished goods being produced in the New World to create that dependency. And to some other extent as well, the labor that you do have in the New World isn't that interested in manufacturing either. Why? Because again, they largely came to the New World so that they could own land. You can't do that as easily. You can't work the land as easily. You're not even going to have the skill set as easily to do manufacturing. You need a simple agricultural style job. Or you would prefer a simple agricultural style job dependent on abundant land, and that's what you're going to use in the colony for the production of things. And so again, then what you see here is this idea that individual colonies or regions of colonies are going to focus on different kinds of manufacturing. Then the southern colonies, again, as we already saw it, we have large-scale production of tobacco, rice, and indigo. In the middle colonies, what you've got is wheat, you've got corn, and so you've got this growing of grain. And again, in New England, you've got self-sufficient growing of crops and resource extraction in terms of fish and wood and some small scale shipbuilding production. But then what we would say is that the southern colonies, they are augmenting or adding on to their large scale production of agriculture with, again, the naval stores and the deer skins, right? This would again help in the shipbuilding industry. That in the middle colonies, what we're seeing is some iron production, some tool production, but for the most part, most of that iron production is being done in New England more so than in the middle colonies. And that in New England, again, you are seeing that shipbuilding to some extent. But what's common, so even though there are these differences in the colonies, the commonality is that they don't really care that much about manufacturing. At least the people don't. The focus is really on the agriculture because of that connection to the land. And so from there, what we, if we want to kind of now understand the rest of the kind of economic picture for these colonies, the one thing would be is that it was developing. They're obviously they don't have an independent currency, so it's largely relying on the barter system, which, as you would learn in principles of macroeconomics, the barter system is pretty limiting for an economy because of that double coincidence of wants, meaning each party has to want what the other has. Not a lot of currency out there. And again, what currency you do have is going to be largely coming from England. And England's not going to want to allow a lot of other coinage to come into the country, again, to create that dependency. And they don't want to provide a lot of capital. And again, you don't have any independent banks. So what you really have here, how I would describe this slide 24, if I were the AI in this making of this slide, I would just say you hobble the colonies further by giving them an underdeveloped financial system and credit system, which is why Alexander Hamilton becomes so important as some of the founding fathers, right? Is that it's Alexander Hamilton, for the most part, that gives us the financial system that we end up having in the United States, and who, I mean, I never saw the play or whatnot, but is our first Treasury Secretary for the United States when we become our own independent country. And that's what we kind of have here as a review then, right? You're using the commodities as money, the tobacco, the rice, the furs. The colonies will start to develop their own paper money. And one of the things that we will see, certainly in the next chapter, is that unlike anywhere else in the world, we become not the first user of paper currency, but the first large-scale users of paper currency. Not sure why the AI slide wanted to put this in here, because we don't really explore it until the next chapter. But again, what you then see is that by 1764, again, where England's starting to realize, what are we going to do now to try to make them even continue to be dependent on us rather than them forging their own path? You get the Currency Act, which then stops the colonies from issuing their own paper currency, and obviously adds to the financial troubles that the colonies have and make them more dependent on the British for their own economic survival. Okay. I'm not sure why. I'm just looking at my notes from the chapter itself. And I'm not sure why it made a slide 26, 27. And I'm not sure why I put in there slides 26 or 27. Sorry, 25 and 26. We're going to talk about that in chapter 7, not really here in chapter 6. So, again, something like that. If I had read that and this had been an assignment, that would have been where I would have detected you used AI, because it's not talked about in the textbook chapter. So let's just keep it to the textbook chapter for now. This was also not in the textbook chapter. It's not entirely clear to me where they would have gotten this data. I mean, no, this is a pretty bad slide. It's not entirely clear to me what it's trying to say, outside of what I've already said to you. So I would dismiss this slide. Okay, that's it actually. So what do we see here? I guess we'll just do the summary here. The limitations on capital, the limitations on the financial system, the limitations on labor, the abundance of land is all shaping the economic development in these colonies. And again, closing comment here, think of the colonies as three countries: Southern, Middle, and Northern. And that's going to help you a lot understand that uneven economic development in the New World. And that's going to help us set the stage for chapter 4 when we look at the relationships of the colonies to England. And we build up. Largely, slides 25, 26, and 27 are actually coming out here in chapter 4, not in chapter 3. Okay.